I think to most of us, getting a report card in high school seemed like getting your teeth cleaned at the dentist. Probably not your favorite thing, but if you showed up and it didn't happen, you'd be confused.
Why am I here?
And fair enough, right? Grades are a big part of the experience, and data shows that from an early age we learn to associate them with intelligence, moral standing, and future success. But if all that's true and grades are an effective part of learning, we have to ask ourselves a question that most Nordic countries have been asking for centuries. How do we explain the Finns? Finnish students get little to no graded homework and only go through one standardized test at the very end of high school, and yet the Finnish public school system consistently ranks at the top of the world for both test scores and for efficiency in their spending. So how? The answer might be that the whole idea of grades based education is broken. It incentivizes teachers, students, and administrators in the wrong way, and it makes school worse. And that's because grading isn't like a tooth cleaning, it's more like hunting rats. Here's how. So, back around 1900, when the French were still colonizing Vietnam, they made a real serious effort in the capital city of Hanoi to show off French culture. They built an opera house and a cathedral, and they put up streetlights, they made it all pretty, and they built a massive sewer system underneath. The opera house, cathedral, and streetlights were generally loved, at least by the colonists, and the sewer system was pretty good too, but it was also full of rats. Because it turns out that 9 miles of tunnels is a good place to breed rodents, and by 1902, the city was infested. That led to an outbreak of plague, and the colonial government was finally forced to actually do something before everybody died. So they came up with a solution that they saw as a win-win. They'd exterminate the rats, and they'd make jobs for the locals by paying a penny for every rat a person killed. All you had to do was kill the rat, cut off its tail, and then drop the tail off at a local government office, and they'd pay you. And for a second there, the plan seemed to be working. Tails were piling up in government offices like plates of spaghetti, I guess. And in the summer of 1902, records show that locals were killing as many as 20,000 rats a day. But the rat population wasn't actually going down. When health inspectors investigated, they found out why. On the outskirts of Hanoi, in basements and back rooms, the people were breeding rats. As soon as the French started counting rat tails, the people went from having a reason to get rid of them to having a reason to make more. So that's how the French colonial government lost a war against some oversized mice. And it's a good example of something called Goodhart's Law, a principle coined by the economist Charles Goodhart that goes like this. When a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. In Hanoi, the measure was rat tails, and the locals did everything in their power to produce more of them. They were incentivized to do that. Our education system has a similar problem, and our rat tails are good grades. So grades are supposed to be a measure of a student's progress. In a nice, perfect world, they'd help teachers communicate expectations, and they'd help share insights on students' progress with parents and other teachers. Meanwhile, in that perfect world, the student would be getting feedback about how to change, learn, and grow, and way up at the top, administrators and politicians could use all those numbers to improve the system as a whole. But here's the thing. Grades, at least on their own, don't actually do any of that. In practice, they fail teachers, they fail parents, they fail students, and they fail administrators. If you were going to give a grade to the concept of grading, you'd have to give it an F. So there's three reasons that's true, based on research studies from literally all over the world. Grades don't work as effective feedback. Grades discourage risk-taking from students and teachers, and they encourage teachers to teach to the test. So maybe the best way to explore that, and definitely the easiest, is by looking at No Child Left Behind, George W. Bush's flagship education program, based on the idea that setting high standards and then establishing measurable goals would improve individual outcomes. It's the sort of education plan that you'd come up with if you really, really, really believed in grades. And you can see that sort of confidence in a quote from Bush at the time, where he said, "We're going to spend more money, more resources, but they'll be directed at methods that work." So looking back, that quote has a very Bush sense of misplaced confidence, and that's because No Child Left Behind is almost universally considered a colossal failure. It's an easy punching bag for almost everyone. But here's the thing. It did accomplish what it set out to do. There's evidence that test scores went up across America over the roughly 15 years that No Child was in effect, although even that is admittedly debatable. But as critics point out, that emphasis on standardized testing resulted in what's called teaching to the test, where teachers focus on material they know would be tested and avoid anything else, which obviously impacts students negatively. Their learning is limited without even going to the question of whether a standardized test is a good measure of the knowledge you're trying to test for in the first place. I mean, some people just aren't good test takers. But beyond that, the whole system provided these massive incentives for cheating and corruption. For example, in 2009, more than 1,000 Atlanta teachers were investigated for cheating on tests. 35 were indicted, 12 went to trial, 11 were found guilty and went to jail. It shouldn't be surprising. NCLB made school funding dependent on high test scores. Jobs and money were on the line. And when that happens, as Goodhart would say, the measure often becomes the goal. But again, the problem with NCLB isn't that it didn't work at all. It did identify schools that were failing their students, and it encouraged them to make desperately needed change. In fact, it put a lot of pressure on them to change. Where it failed was providing those schools with effective guidelines to make those changes or to focus on what really matters in the end. More training for teachers, improved curriculums, and like modernized learning structures. The Atlantic put it pretty well when they said, well, NCLB acknowledged the critical role that teachers play in student and school success, it did not directly attempt to improve the quality of teaching. Which means that No Child Left Behind, as a program, had the exact same problems that grading itself does in general. It put a really big emphasis on quote-unquote measuring success in a way that incentivized terrible strategies to achieve that success. Cheating, teaching to the test, all that kind of stuff. And all this while failing to provide any concrete feedback that would actually lead to future growth. Research has repeatedly shown that providing grades as feedback in classrooms has no positive effect on performance because a letter or percent grade doesn't actually offer any concrete steps to improve. At the same time, grading literally slows down learning by discouraging students to take risks or make mistakes, things that are genuinely proven to boost learning. People tend to learn by screwing up, but if your future success is dependent on your grade, you're going to focus on that and avoid trying anything too fancy. The whole system makes it so that the goal in classrooms is less to learn what's being taught and more to teach what's being counted. And that means that if administrators use the data taken from standardized tests to make decisions about the education system, they're going to be basing their choices off of faulty information. So the evidence seems to show that at the very least, we should be exploring different strategies for student assessment. And the big question is, why are we still so focused on grades then? This is my own idea and maybe my own bias, but I think that it's part of a relatively society-wide failure to recognize a fact of social science, that you can't count a human behavior without affecting that behavior. In theory, you could count how many people are in this photo, or even what percentage of them are giving a thumbs up. I don't want to do it right now, but you could, and you'd get a number. But if you then took that data and used it to extrapolate how many people in a given crowd are likely to have their thumb out at a given moment, or maybe how happy those stock photo people actually are, your data would obviously be useless. They were paid to be there. That's the reason they did it. And so obviously that's a stupid example, but the impulse to count and measure indiscriminately without a full appreciation for what happens when you do that is a legitimate phenomenon, and it's not too far from how we evaluate the performance of children in school, using specific numbers gleaned from a highly controlled and arbitrary assessment to determine something far more complicated. At Big Human, we work a lot with clients who ask us to replace qualitative research, like interviews and workshops, that kind of thing, with quantitative research like surveys, and I get it. Percentages and graphs and data charts have this sort of concrete appeal. They just seem more legit. And they're genuinely useful. It can be good information. But when it comes to people, data like that is only useful if they're grounded in the understanding that they're inherently imperfect and incomplete. There's lots of things you can measure quantitatively and objectively, but the complexity of human behavior, especially when it comes to something as complicated as learning, needs nuance. Right now, grading in school is holding back education outcomes because that understanding isn't there. But there's a movement growing to complement grading in classrooms with things like student self-assessment, or even getting rid of grading altogether. Like I said at the beginning of the video, that's what's been going on in Finland for years, and their place at the head of most education rankings is proof that it's working. And other countries, like even China, are taking notice. The Chinese government, for all its flaws, are working to make their education system rely less on stringent standards and testing, and that mirrors a trend around the world. But I want to keep this video relatively short though, so I'll stop myself from going to more concrete examples of education leaving grades behind, but I'll link to some interesting articles and videos in the description. For now, I'm excited to see what happens next. Thanks for watching. This was Big Human Ideas, Episode 2.